ਅਕਾਲ ਚੈਨਲ ਨੂੰ ਸਬਸਕ੍ਰਾਈਬ ਕਰੋ। ਨਵੀਂ ਵੀਡੀਓਜ਼ ਦੀ ਨੋਟੀਫਿਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਬੈਲ ਆਈਕਨ ਨੂੰ ਕਲਿੱਕ ਕਰਨਾ ਨਾ ਭੁੱਲਣਾ।
Welcome to another edition of the Insight Show with myself, Jaswant Bora. And on today's show, I have an interesting guest all the way from Alabama, America, by the name of Dr. Mark Potok. Hello, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you just fine.
Smashing. Just really to introduce yourself, you've been a national reporter, and you reported on the issue regarding the religious sect of Branch Davidians, covering the 51-day story in Waco in 1993 with David Koresh. And you've also covered the Oklahoma City bombing and the trial of Timothy McVeigh in 1995, where 168 people were killed. You've led numerous investigations. You're a senior fellow of the well-known American Southern Poverty Law Center, a civil rights organization based in America. And you've worked with over 1,500 extremist groups across America. And you've also testified before the US Senate, US High Commission on Human Rights. So there's quite lengthy background there in this issue and subject that we're discussing today around radical and the rise of the far right. Taking in consideration what I've just said, Mark, in your view, to what extent is the problem of the radical and the far right happening in terms of in America, in the West? Is it becoming a gradual problem?
Well, I would say it's not becoming a gradual problem. It is becoming a severe problem at this point. Things have gotten worse and worse. The radical right has grown in real leaps and bounds over the course of the last 30 years.
It seems...
I am getting feedback now.
Okay. It seems as though, given all the attacks that have taken place over the last decade, we're talking about the fascist and neo-Nazis of Anders Breivik in Norway in 2011, where 69 plus people were killed. Someone who puts in his manifesto around the arguments of multiculturalism and the Islamification of Islam in Europe. We see what happened in Christchurch, the massacre this year. 49 were killed by the Australian Brendan Tarrant, also arguing some of these points. And there was also, we see shootings that happening in El Paso, all the way there in America in August this year, Mark, where he tried to rationalize his attacks and targeting the Hispanic community and population, arguing that, and I quote, "We're defending our own country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by invasion." There's kind of a replacement theory concept here. So these individuals, these extremists, appear to be justifying their arguments based on some quite very severe ideology.
That is true, that their ideology is very extreme. I think, though, that the important thing to understand here is that these are not merely mentally ill people or people who have watched too much violent television or people who perhaps have read too much neo-Nazi materials on the internet. While all of those things may be true to some extent, the reality is that our society in the United States, just as society in the United Kingdom and much of Western Europe, is changing and is changing radically. We are going through a major societal upheaval in a number of different ways related to globalization. And this is really what is driving the movement underneath all the rest. When I say that, what I mean is the effects of globalization are wreaking really a massive societal change. On a demographic level, we see the populations of countries like the United States changing dramatically. Our Census Bureau in the United States has predicted that the white population in this country, which has been about 95% since the colonial era, is now dropping rapidly to the point that in by about 2043, whites will be a minority in this country. They will be fewer than 50% of the population. So there is a huge demographic change, and it's rather striking here. At the same time, the financial effects of globalization are being felt very strongly. Workers in industrial sectors like steel and auto, like textile plants, and any number of other sectors along those lines are in real trouble. That is not always visible in the media of this country. Not a lot of attention is paid to these people, but there are enormous sectors of the population that are in real financial trouble. And thirdly, I would point out the cultural effects of globalization. Probably the most dramatic example of the cultural changes I'm talking about are the way that same-sex marriage, which was unimaginable some 15, 20 years ago to most people, today is legal in all 50 states. So what I'm saying is that our society is going through a period of great stress, and many people are reacting very poorly to it. I'm not suggesting that the radical right is correct in its response. I'm simply saying that there are underlying socioeconomic causes that go beyond merely the fact that the internet makes it easier to reach people with radical propaganda, or that certain algorithms are really driving this. There's something underneath all of this which is very important.
You gave some statistics there, Mark, and around 2043, certain groups will become a minority, some will become a majority, which, depending how we perceive that, whether we perceive it as, some may perceive it as a threat, some may seek to celebrate diversity. In saying that, these why some of these groups, I mean, even historically, and you've studied groups or separatist or nationalist and other groups similar to that of the Ku Klux Klan over the years, who have also called for the purification of American society. Are some of these views and concepts still alive? Are they pre-existing? Are they thriving in terms of, similar views and concepts and ideologies? Would groups say today in America, Europe, and in other parts of the world where they're campaigning now, particularly in politics, that there is a strong expansion of far-right groups gaining power and momentum?
Well, it is certainly true that beginning in the 1950s and 60s, when we were going through our civil rights movement here in the United States, that these ideologies seemed to be very much on the decline. And certainly by the 1970s, they seem to be on their very last legs. They seem to be dying out. But what has happened is, of course, these changes then in our society have picked up speed and become more and more obvious to the population at large. At the same time, the last factor that is terribly important in understanding what has happened here in the United States is the fact that politicians, leaders of all kind, and most dramatically our president, Donald Trump, have been pouring fuel on this fire in a very direct way. I do not think it is too much to say that Donald Trump, if he is not personally a white nationalist or a white supremacist, he absolutely has encouraged white nationalism in all its noxious forms. So it's worth remembering that the El Paso mass murderer used language in his manifesto that was almost identical to the language used by our president. Mm-hmm. He talked about an invasion, a Hispanic invasion. Mm-hmm. He talked about an infestation of this country by foreigners who are not like us. And those are words and ideas that come straight out of the president's mouth. So, yes, this is also very much an international movement, particularly in the Western world. And the idea of the Great Replacement, the theory, of course, by Renaud Camus, the idea that whites are being replaced by other people, that somehow whites are under attack and will soon disappear or become irrelevant, that idea has caught on very widely. In the United States, the radical right frequently talks about the idea of, quote, white genocide. In other words, they make it sound like whites are being murdered in the streets, in their hundreds of thousands. Of course, that's utterly false, and really what is happening is that the radical right is looking to a time when a portion of the population identified itself as purely white, 100% white, all American, or as the Ku Klux Klan used to say, 100% American. And, so their idea is that if a baby is born that has 99 100ths pure, quote-unquote, white blood, and 1% some other kind of quote-unquote blood, that this baby is lost to the white race. So, it's a bit of a paranoid fiction. The country is not, we are not at the brink of revolution. The country is not collapsing. But there is a change going on, and, there are ideas that are being put forward by thinkers on the radical right, many of them Europeans, peoples like Anders Breivik, like Renaud Camus, like the man who wrote the infamous novel, The Camp of the Saints. These are all ideas that have been built steadily over the course of the last 30 or 40 years by the extreme right, and now all of a sudden they are, in a sense, in vogue. And that is, as I say, thanks to people like Donald Trump. One could perhaps include Boris Johnson in that, and certainly many other nationalist leaders around Europe, the Hungarians, the Poles, and so on.
It sounds then, just as terror groups like Islamic State seek to establish a caliphate, and they have the ideology and narratives, groups and certain political groups and white supremacists and other nationalists seek to now want to establish their, if I can use that inverted commas, caliphate concept, whereby we want states and or say in America or even parts of England, and we talk about democracy. But it seems to be another underpinning message here that really is putting at risk and jeopardy the cohesion of other racial and religious groups to live together, to live in harmony. Quite recently, you're probably aware, Mark, that President Modi was in America, in the state of Dallas and Texas, where he made speech, and he's talking about collaboration, and President Trump and senators were there and parts of Congress. And he appears to be celebrating that quite strongly. So why isn't he then campaigning more? Because experts are saying, Mark, that both Obama and Trump administration have not diverted enough federal resources to pursue terrorism tied to white extremism, punishing most counterterrorism efforts that are fighting groups associated with these kind of extremist groups and all that. Is there a lack of resources? We've got the FBI, we've got the Department for Homeland Security and other bodies that have been set up. Are they diverting the resources away from these kind of concerns?
Yes. I think in the United States, very much as in the United Kingdom and a number of European countries, there has been a real reluctance to look at what the real threat is. After the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 by a man who was arguably a white nationalist, there was a very great deal of attention given to the idea of domestic terrorists, and that was really the beginning for us. Until that time, there was a very marked reluctance for even describe the Ku Klux Klan as a terrorist group. But after 168 people were murdered in Oklahoma City, at least for a time, the American public and law enforcement in particular recognized that there was a very real threat. Here was a young man with, fair hair and blue eyes and white as the driven snow, willing to murder 168 men, women, and children for his cause. However, 6 years later, we went through the 9/11 attacks, and at that point, I would say the lessons of Oklahoma City were largely forgotten. What has happened in the 17 or 18 years since then is that we have seen an increasing pace of white nationalist mass murders, to say it plainly. And, most dramatically, very recently, of course, were the 22 people murdered in El Paso. So, we are once again essentially relearning the lessons of the past. Now, today, for the first time in many years, the FBI is describing white supremacist domestic terrorism as the major terrorist threat faced by the United States. But to answer your question directly, no, there are not enough resources being applied to this very, very serious threat. And that is largely a function, especially of the Trump administration. The Obama administration was not wonderful about this. They also tended to look mainly at jihadist, at Islamist terrorism, without much concern for white supremacist violence. But that has certainly gotten worse under President Trump. Trump at one point floated the idea of changing the name of the Countering Violent Extremism program to Countering Islamist Extremism. So, I think in particular in this administration, there's a very strong reluctance to look at the realities, and that has meant, for instance, that programs which were rather hopeful, programs like the exit programs that you see in many European countries, were essentially defunded by the Trump administration. So, I was just at a conference 2 weeks ago hosted by the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington, D.C., and, I would say that for the first time in memory, probably in at least 100 years, there was a consensus in that room, and these are the leading federal law enforcement agencies, that domestic terrorism from white supremacist groups and individuals was the number one threat and something that we needed to look carefully at moving additional resources toward.
This is something that years ago was probably overlooked or ignored because of the threat of September the 11th, the threat from Al-Qaeda and other groups. Resources and money and time and effort was all put towards tackling that particular threat, which to some extent these and other groups are still a threat today. However, it seems now statistics, and you mentioned some statistics, Mark, particularly in England, we have now, as far as the police and other enforcement security services are concerned, some of these statistics now suggest to us that the far right are becoming more of a threat. We have, particularly say in West Midlands or in England, police or counter-terrorism detectives now bring out statistics that they're arresting more people under, say, terrorism legislation for issues of far right, and they being of white origin and from white backgrounds. Comparing that to, say, years ago, of Asian or Islamic or Pakistani backgrounds, there's a gradual shift, and it seems now they're coming to the forefront. Equally, have programs in place like we have the PVE or the Prevent Agenda post July 7/7 bombings. Then, to what extent are your statistics, whether it's from police or others in counties, again informing us or telling us now we need to start rethinking and reshaping policies that we have to now look more in depth at the far right and the radical right?
Well, there are a whole variety of statistics, and I don't have them all in front of me, but for instance, recently someone produced, an academic think tank produced numbers showing that 109 people had been murdered since 9/11 by people on the radical right versus 104 by Islamist terrorists. More recently, there are some statistics showing that in the last couple of years, something like 3/4, some 74% of major terrorist attacks or planned attacks have been by white supremacist domestic terrorists, as opposed to Islamists of any stripe, whether based in the United States or coming from abroad. So, yeah, I mean, the statistics are quite plain, and they are getting stronger and stronger all the time. Let me say, just that. Yeah, no, just that. Another related matter, you asked earlier about this idea of creating an Islamist caliphate and how does that compare to American or to white supremacist ideology. And there are very distinct similarities, the most dramatic one being that white supremacists in the United States have had a kind of fantasy for almost 40 years now about creating an all-white country within the United States. Even the white supremacists realize that they can't kill everyone who they disagree with or who is not white. So they've essentially settled on the idea of we need to carve out a country within the United States which will be for white people and only white people. And concomitant with this idea is the idea that certain places like Florida will be given to Latinos, people of Hispanic origin. New York State will be given to people of Jewish origin, that kind of thing. But the main part of the United States, in their fantasies, in their fever dreams, would be a country that is purely white and in which no one else is allowed to reside.
Just for the last minute or so, Mark, to what extent then is, quickly we summarize, is Congress or Democrats or the Republicans tackling this issue, raising it, discussing it, debating it in the House of Representatives? Are they still doing that? And then just to summarize, what are some of the ways forward?
Well, in fact, the Congress is doing very little to combat this threat. Certainly many Democrats have spoken out and even held hearings on the threat of white supremacy, but not much has been accomplished, and this is largely due to Republican opposition. You know, as far as the way forward, that is a very difficult question. We are facing, I think, 20 or 30 more years of this difficult period in which we are going through, as I've tried to say, this massive transformation. In 20 or 30 years, this country will be multicultural in a way that it never has been, and God willing, the society will kind of calm down and learn to live with these changes.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for joining us from Alabama. Thank you very much for your input.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for our viewers for watching the Insight Show. Until next time, my name is Jaswan Bora. Take care and God bless.
ਅਕਾਲ ਚੈਨਲ ਨੂੰ ਸਬਸਕ੍ਰਾਈਬ ਕਰੋ। ਨਵੀਂ ਵੀਡੀਓਜ਼ ਦੀ ਨੋਟੀਫਿਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਬੈਲ ਆਈਕਨ ਨੂੰ ਕਲਿੱਕ ਕਰਨਾ ਨਾ ਭੁੱਲਣਾ।